starting over.
So we're going to go ahead and start with the first panel discussion for this evening. I'd like to invite to the stage Elana Bregin and Damon Galgut, both South African writers, as well as Siphiwo Mahala. Come on. So, as I mentioned earlier, the first panel discussion is themed Perspectives of South African Writing. I will leave it to you, Siphiwo, to introduce the writers, and for the rest of us, you can sit back, relax, and enjoy the discussion.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Siphiwo Mahala. I'm a writer, and in my spare time, I work for the Department of Arts and Culture. Our topic this evening, perspective on South African literature. We have two very accomplished but grossly underrated writers. Next to me is Elana Bregin, known as the editor for UKZN Press. She was almost my editor. You dropped me. But she edited Tandon Golozana's A Man Who's Not a Man. So that was a consolation which became a runaway success. But she's accomplished herself as a writer. She is multi-award winning. Has written the Redhead Kumalo, Shiva's Dance, and the latest one, which I thoroughly enjoyed, is Survival for Lonely Hearts. And on the other side, we have Damon Galgut, internationally acclaimed and multi-award winning writer. He's written so many books, I often lose count. But I read somewhere that you were diagnosed with cancer at age 6. And that was essentially his stepping stone in writing, because as visitors read to him books, he got addicted and he hasn't stopped. That's why he's written so many books. You published your first book at age 17. Yeah. And he's got 2 books shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, The Good Doctor in 2004 and The Imposter in 2010. So I'm going to give them a chance to give us a taste of what they write. I'm not sure who will be the first on the guillotine.
Shall I do it?
Okay. Damon volunteered.
I'm going to read from The Good Doctor, and I'm taking the reading from the opening of the book, so hopefully no explanation will be necessary. The first time I saw him, I thought, he won't last. I was sitting in the office in the late afternoon, and he appeared suddenly in the doorway, carrying a suitcase in one hand and wearing plain clothes, jeans and a brown shirt, with his white coat on top. He looked young and lost and a bit bewildered, but that wasn't why I thought what I did. It was because of something else, something I could see in his face. He said, "Hello, is this the hospital?" His voice was unexpectedly deep for somebody so tall and thin. "Come in," I said, "put down your bag." He came in, but he didn't put down the bag. He held it close while he looked around at the pink walls, the empty chairs, the dusty desk in the corner, the frail plants wilting in their pots. I could see that he thought there'd been some kind of mistake. I felt sorry for him. "I'm Frank Eloff," I said. "I'm Lawrence Waters." "I know." "You know?" He seemed amazed that we should be expecting him, though he'd been sending faxes for days already announcing his arrival. "We're sharing a room," I told him. "Let me take you over." The room was in a separate wing. We had to cross an open space of ground close to the parking lot. When he came in, he must have walked this way, but now he looked at the path through the long grass, the ragged trees overhead dropping their burden of leaves, as if he'd never seen them before. We went down the long passage to the room. I'd lived and slept alone in here until today. 2 beds, a cupboard, a small carpet, a print on one wall, a mirror, a green sofa, a low coffee table made of synthetic wood, a lamp. It was all basic standard issue. The few occupied rooms all looked the same, as in some featureless, bleak hotel. Now that he was standing here, I could see through his eyes that the room was ugly and bare. And Lawrence Waters didn't look to me like the person I'd pictured in my head. I don't know what I'd imagined, but it wasn't this bland, biscuit-coloured young man, almost a boy still, who was at last putting his suitcase down. He took his glasses off and rubbed them on his sleeve. He put them on again and said wearily, "I don't understand." What? This whole place? The hospital? Not just the hospital, I mean... He waved a hand to indicate the world out there. He meant the town outside the hospital walls. "You asked to come here." "But I didn't know that it would be like this." "Why?" he said with sudden intensity. "I don't understand." "We can talk about it later, but I'm on duty now. I have to go back to the office." "I must see Dr. Ngema," he said abruptly. "She's expecting me." "Don't worry about that now. You can do it in the morning. No hurry." "What should I do now?" "Whatever you like. Unpack, settle in, or come and sit with me. I'll be finished in a couple of hours." I left him alone and went back. He was shocked and depressed. I understood that. I'd felt it myself when I first arrived. You came expecting one thing and were met by something else completely. You came expecting a busy, modern hospital, rural maybe and small, but full of activity, in a town where things were happening. This was the capital of what used to be one of the homelands. So whatever the morality of the politics that gave rise to it, you expected a place full of administration and movement, people coming and going. And when you turned off the main route to the border and were coming in on the one minor road that led here, it might still look, when you saw the place from a distance, like what you'd expected. There was the main street leading to the centre where the fountain and the statue stood, the shop fronts and pavements and street lights, and all the buildings beyond. It looked neat and calibrated and exact. Not a bad place to be. And then you arrived and you saw. Maybe the first clue was a disturbing detail, a crack that ran through an otherwise pristine wall, or a set of broken windows in an office you passed, or the fact that the fountain was dry and full of old sand at the bottom. And you slowed down, looking around you with vague anxiety, and suddenly it all came into clear focus. The weeds in the joints of the pavements and bricks, the grass growing at places in the street, the fused lamps and the empty shops behind their blank glass fronts, and the mildew and damp and blistered paint and the marks of rain on every surface, and the slow tumbling down of solid structures, sometimes grain by grain, sometimes in pieces, and you were not sure anymore of where you were. Thank you.
Over to you, Elana.
Okay. This will be a real change of register now. That's one of my favorite books. I'm going to read something from Survival Training for Lonely Hearts. And I have to just say a few words about this book because it's not as self-explanatory as Damon's. It's a book about many things. It's a book about what the title says, Survival Training for Lonely Hearts. But it's not just about the loneliness of being unattached. It's also about the loneliness of being part of a very disconnected society and a very divided society, and one that is traumatized and in great need of finding love for itself. I have to issue a warning. Those who like their categories pure, please don't read this book. It does a lot of boundary crossing. It is not chick lit. It is not socio-political study. So you might have sleepless nights if you're somebody that likes to know where to pigeonhole it. I'm going to read from a lighter side of the book. It's the part where Kate, who's the editor, goes for lunch with her boss and publisher, Alistair. And he's a very charming, attractive, but quite bloody in some ways as well. He has certain sides to him that make him not very nice to be near. But in this section, they're talking about Kate has gone online in search of the mythical soulmate, and he's taking the mickey out of her a little bit. So, talking of no hopers, Alistair said, how's it going with the mating game? Kate grimaced. Not as much fun as I'd hoped. I admire your gumption, putting yourself up for public auction like that. Takes guts. I don't think I could do it. You wouldn't need to. You only have to crook your pinky and the women fall at your feet. He grinned at that. Met anyone with married potential? Not even close. I'm having trouble getting past the profiles. They're all so uninspired. I feel like I'm reading the same one over and over. So they're not writers. Give them a break. Even their names are the same. They all turn out to be called Pete. He laughed. Don't be discouraged. It only needs one Mr. Right, remember. Well, if he's out there, he's well camouflaged. You say that with edge. Let me put it this way. Men of this age group are not always photogenically attractive. Unlike women of this age group, you mean? Well, at least the women take more care. They don't just plonk their ID photos up. They go to the trouble of making sure that their calling cards is a decent one. I take it you mean like yours. Okay, I admit, I haven't put a photo up yet. But if I did, I'd at least make sure that it was a flattering one. You should put one on. You might get better offers if you did. Kate shuddered. If you're going to be a hooker, then hook, he said. There's no point pretending you're only out there window shopping. Thank you. I'd never considered it in that light before, she winced. He grinned his charming grin at her. You want my personal opinion? Not really. Your trouble is that you have an unrealistic expectation of men. You think so, she said flippantly. Well, considering how low my expectations of men are, that doesn't leave much room for hope. I mean it, he said. We chaps are a pretty basic lot, you know. Take us at face value and you'll find we grow on you. You come over all puritanical and you're going to get nothing but a big fat fart in your face. How poetically you put things. Listen to what I'm telling you. I know you. You're too idealistic for your own good. He must be this, he mustn't be that. Forget all those non-negotiables. You have to have non-negotiables, she said. There are some things you just can't compromise on. Like what? Well, political differences for starters. You know what this country's like. Racists, bigots, and xenophobes. That rules out half the men of my age group at least. And then, of course, there's the fact that they're all flesh eaters. That rules out the other half. Ditto with smokers and drug users and boozers, not to mention men still carrying torches for their exes. You wouldn't believe how many of those there are. And while we're about it, let's rule out. Alistair held up his hand. My head is spinning, he said. All I heard were no's and mustn't be's. You reeled them off without a breath. I begin to see the problem. You have more bottom lines than a menopausal derriere. Your ideal man is a portrait of knots. You need to cut some slack. Give us poor mortals a chance. I just want someone on my wavelength. Is that too much to ask? I suppose not, said Alistair, sounding dubious. Someone who cares how the other half lives. Someone who's kind. Alistair looked at her in amusement. Darling, let me give you a little tip. Men don't consider kind a sexy quality. Even if they've got it, they're not going to flaunt it on a dating site. They're much more likely to want to advertise penis size. She had to laugh at his incorrigible humour. Well, thanks for the encouragement. You're welcome. All I can say is keep at it. Presumably your Mr. Wonderful is out there somewhere. The question is, would you recognise him if you found him? Or would you switch channels because he's a bad-spelling smoker named Pete? How do you know you haven't already encountered him, in fact? I know, she said. Believe me. Have you considered that it might be your profile that's the problem, he said. The wrong branding can be the kiss of death to any enterprise. To attract the good fish, you have to use the right bait. There's nothing wrong with my profile. It's well written. Ah, but does it have the wow factor? His blue eyes roved over her thoughtfully, leaving a faint tingle where they rested. There's no reason why you should still be on the shelf, he said. You're an attractive broad, no question. Still sexy when you take the trouble to do yourself up. Do myself up, she said. I haven't heard that one since Pa fell off the bus. Since what? Haven't you heard that saying? It means, I know what it means, darling girl. I'm just surprised to hear it issuing from the mouth of my erudite editor. His words were slurring slightly. She could see the scotch was hitting him. She envied him his ability to wear drunkenness so elegantly. He was such an attractive man, sitting there with the grey blonde fetlock falling over his forehead, those blue befuddled eyes so winsome, and that air of confident ownership of all things. If he wasn't her boss, would she have fallen for him? Many women did. I suppose, he said, what it really comes down to is how brave our prospective Romeo is. What's that supposed to mean? You can be quite an off-putting dame, you know. When you're sitting on that moral high ground of yours, even I get cowed. And you're too independent. Are you saying self-sufficiency is a turn-off? Nothing wrong with it in principle, he said. Adds to the challenge, you know. But a woman has to know when to fall. He sucked at his glass and seemed surprised to find it empty. Your trouble is aloof. You don't signal availability. Maybe the way you dress. What's wrong with the way I dress? He made motions towards his chest. You need to uncover a bit. Men like flesh. Get more slutty. More slutty, she said. You mean as in low-cut blouses and a waggle when I walk? It wouldn't hurt, he grinned. That sort of thing's important. Opens the door. Gives men confidence to try their luck.
I must confess, when I saw this book, Survival Training, I thought it was a manual.
Yes. The categories worried you.
Yeah. You've been writing for young adults mainly. And what made you venture into this, should I call it romantic literature?
Well, I'm so glad you raised that, Siphiwo, because, yes, I have been labelled as a children's writer. I started off in the 1990s and had some success with the youth novels, and they were always, for me, very focused on South Africa and where we were with it and how to bring it down to the level of young adults who were going to be the next generation. But I did write other things after that, but somehow the tape stuck at the young adult. So there have been a couple of books before Survival Training. Why did I venture into romance? For me, this is more a love story than romance. First of all, I have to say that romance is a bit of a misaligned category. It's a good thing to be writing at the moment because romance helps to rehumanize. We've just had such a surfeit of the political and the issues, and romance is a way of getting back to the people. But the reason I say that it's a love story is because it's a much wider love story than just about lonely hearts searching for each other. It's a love story with South Africa, my love story with South Africa, and it's about the need to find love for each other again, for ourselves again, because that's where it all starts, and especially for ourselves as a nation, because I don't believe we're going to solve any of our issues until we start loving ourselves as a nation. All of that, I hope, is in the book.
And you think that love, we can find it on the internet?
Well, my character struggles a bit with that one, yes.
Okay. Damon, the extract you read, unfortunately you can't relate to this. It reminds me of a particular film. I think Ndumiso Nobo maybe would relate, Shawshank Redemption. If you recall the part where Andy arrives at Shawshank Prison. Shawshank is one of the greatest movies I've ever seen, and it is also mellow, not very dramatic, like your writing. And that is what strikes me about your writing, that the simplicity of it, the smoothness of it, and yet it's evocative. So if I have to ask a question, basically, I'm interested in your writing process. What makes it come so natural?
I do a great deal of rewriting, basically. My natural instinct as a writer is to try to express what it is I have to say in as few words as possible. But initially, there are far too many words. So it's a process of paring down and paring down. There's a quote in a poem by Yeats, which I'm probably going to misremember, but it's something about I am going to misremember it, so let me leave it be. Probably the first draft of this book was 3 times that length, and basically, through working and reworking, I bring it down and bring it down. The biggest key for me, writing-wise, and it's advice I try to give all aspiring writers, is that it's one thing to engage with the material that you're wanting to write. You need that passionate, the intense engagement with something, the feeling that you have something to say. But for a lot of younger writers, I think they believe that's where the process ends. And in fact, that's only the start. You need to return to that material, and you need to leave all the heat behind and approach it very coldly. You need to be able to read your own writing as if it was written by someone else, and to judge it accordingly. So for me, the real work in writing is in that second stage, basically. So yeah, I'm glad you think it flows naturally, but in fact the process was anything but.
Yeah, but also that smoothness you find it in your characters, your protagonists especially. Reading these 2 books, The Good Doctor and The Imposter, there's something in common between Lawrence and Damon. That they are somewhat reclusive, almost outsiders. Why is that dominating your writing?
That sort of strand of things, I suppose, I'm less aware of. You do express yourself through your writing, even in an unconscious way. I don't feel as if I'm a reclusive outsider, but people tell me I am. I'm more interested in people who are on the margins of events. I mean, the setting of the book itself is kind of marginal. It's a small town in what was one of the former Bantustans, and these doctors have been sent there for, community service. And that's immediately more attractive for me. I don't think I've ever written anything that has a city setting primarily. So even being out on the edge of things is more attractive. Why that is, I can't tell you. I'm sure Freud would have an explanation, but he's not here.
And actually, I'm glad you linked to yourself. The protagonist here is Damon.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a traveler. And I've read that you actually yourself a traveler. Actually, what I've realized is that Damon in reverse there's some implication there. Can you explain?
Well, I'm not answerable for my name, I'm afraid. But yes, Damon in reverse is nomad. It's just a happy accident that it came to describe me, I guess.
So your characters live a nomadic life as a result?
Well, not all of them, but in that particular book, I think in A Strange Room, I think it's pretty obvious if you read it that it's very close to home. I mean, those are not so much fictional creations as confessions of a sort. So yeah, they're stories that come from a particular period in my life when I was very restless and very unable to settle down, not because I was curious about the world so much as because a certain kind of internal unhappiness made it impossible for me to sit still. And yeah, that book was kind of an attempt to slice open that condition to some extent and, analyze it perhaps, or give voice to it rather. But not all my books deal with travelers. It's that particular one, and that one is far more autobiographical than anything else I've done.
Okay. Well, thanks. Elana, I think what is common also is that element of searching for a partner in life, so to speak. And at some point, I felt pity for Kate. I wanted to help her find someone.
Luckily, she did.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is that she meets so many people, and there are different kinds of characters. How did you come up with so many men?
I did my research.
Yeah, my favorite is one guy who tells her that he is in the meat what industry?
I forget how he puts it. Yes, he's a meat entrepreneur or something like that.
I think I have it somewhere. He is a meat entrepreneur, and in simple terms, he's a butcher.
That was part of my intention in this book, because Kate is an editor. She gets to cross boundaries. She gets to encounter people from other lives and societies that she wouldn't normally come into contact with. And then when she goes online, she encounters the other spectrum of South Africa, which is not always a complimentary kind of spectrum to encounter. It's just so full of baggage, and I'm very preoccupied, especially at the moment. I keep saying, with where we are now, are we ever going to be able to disentangle ourselves from our history? At what point are we going to get beyond that political scar tissue and stop seeing category instead of people? I just think of, my hatred for you is older than I am. I'm sorry, but for me, you are your race. I think that was Zach Rapola. Mm-hmm. And through that whole spectrum of people that she encounters, I'm exploring where we are, what do we do with it, where do we go from here. So where do I get my many characters from? I think we live with that whole spectrum. Sorry?
Men.
Where do I get my many characters from? That spectrum is out there.
Yeah.
That spectrum is out there.
Yeah, but I also like the way you give insight into the publishing industry. There's this particular extra that I'm going to read quickly. She said, it says, she loved working with authors like Thokozani, valued deep connection forged in the course of the difficult shared journeys, the special paths that such manuscripts gave her to lives and realities far removed from her own, entering those worlds, gaining admission to those private interiors, always felt to her like privileged access. Is that how you feel really working with others?
Absolutely.
Every
author that I've worked with, I really do feel that it's been a privileged access, and that is the wonderful thing about editing, especially the kind of books that I edit, which are not so much the academic, but the life story or the novel or the...
Yeah, okay. And the author, Thokozani here, I couldn't help thinking about Paswane MP.
Yeah, he's not supposed to be Paswane MP, but Paswane MP was, for me, my first author. So there are similarities, and it really was a sort of opening for me, a real eye-opening into into the interior of people that I wouldn't otherwise have known.
Okay, wow. Okay, Damon, I understand you don't even own a TV.
I'm afraid not.
And neither a cell phone.
That's
Do you
true.
know we're in the 21st century?
I feel so reassured. But I thought I was behind not having a BlackBerry, so...
I'm interested in your titles. I was looking at some of your titles, The Sinless Season, The Beautiful beautiful, I almost says squealing, beautiful screaming of pigs. What's that?
I regret that title, actually. I've been doing this quite a long time, so my sensibility, if you like, in terms of giving books titles has shifted over the years. I don't have any kind of neat generic observation to make to you about the titles. I struggle with them, and very often it's the last thing that comes to me in the writing of a book. It would be satisfying if the title arrived earlier, because I think a lot of the themes tend to coagulate around a title. But sometimes you're just kind of fumbling in the dark at the end. Yeah, it's not my strongest point.
Okay, is that the same with you?
I find titles difficult. Sometimes the title is the first thing to come, and it's there, and it's just great. But if it's not there in the beginning, I struggle as much as you do, and you get to the end of the book and you say, well, what am I going to call it? And it takes kind of several sleepless nights before something takes shape. Yeah. I don't find titles easy.
And in this case?
In this case, this book started off its life with a different title. It was actually called The Company of Dogs, and the title was changed because it was felt that it didn't give the overall sense. But dogs play a big part in this book. For me, they are a step along the road to rehumanizing. And in The Company of Dogs, the heroine would have lived quite contentedly if fate and her author hadn't had other plans for her. So.
Why did you kill Giuseppe?
Thanks for giving away the whole...
Yeah, and also, I like the way you can develop a story around a dog. Okay, 2 dogs.
It's easier for me to develop a story around the dogs than the men.
Is there something common between men and dogs?
Yeah. There's a line here where she says to the dog, just be glad you're a dog. The only arsehole you have to worry about is your own.
Oh my. Maybe on that note, we should give the audience a chance to ask questions. Nothing about men and dogs. Let there be light, please.
I'm interested to know how long it took you to write these books and how long it generally takes you to write a novel.
Damon?
Damon, I know you write all the time.
Writing full-time is not the same thing as writing all the time. In my case, it varies quite a lot from book to book. This probably took 3 years, and 3 years is probably an average time. But I have written a book in 6 weeks once, in a sort of feverish kind of way. So a lot depends on how connected I feel to the material and also how personal it is. So
I'm going to make you feel better about your 3 years now. This one took me, I think it was 5 years to write, partly because I work full time, so I had to keep squashing it into holidays and getting interrupted, and that was very demoralizing. So eventually I gave up altogether and I wrote another book in between. And then when I came back to this, I found that break had done the book and me a lot of good. It allowed me to feed in a whole lot of other things, and so it became richer.
Actually, I expected more from Damon. I mean, when you don't have TV, what do you do for fun? You write and build books?
I don't think you want to know what I do for fun. So
do you guys reread the books you've written all of the years? Do you guys read the books you've written?
No.
Why?
Finished them, do we go back and reread them? No.
Why?
You live with it for such a long time, and you reread it and reread it and reread it and redo drafts and do the editing and do the proofreading, and by the end of that time, you finish.
Background. I know your book well, and I enjoyed reading it a couple of years ago. The disappointment with this young doctor who finds himself in this hospital with somebody possibly like you, almost reticent. It gave a good insight into the state of hospitals at that time in the rural areas. And of course, now that has sort of exploded even into the city and urban hospitals, the state and the conditions. It was quite interesting to see what happens to this young doctor.
No, I don't have any medical background. I mean, that was a challenge in the writing of the book, and initially my instinctive feeling was that I needed to do a great amount of research, which I did do. I mean, I spoke to a lot of doctor friends, thinking that if you supplied more detail, you would be more convincing. And I realized at a certain point that the opposite was true. In fact, if you say only what is essential to the plot at the appropriate moment, you will create the illusion that you know what you're talking about, in fact. I mean, medicine is not the subject of the book, really. It's a lens through which you can look at the real themes. So the state of hospitals was a concern. I was watching, I was reading newspapers and keeping clippings and so on. But really, just to give a texture rather than to go into details of medical accuracy or anything like that. The people were more important than the medical issues for me.
And to talk about Good Doctor, I've been trying to figure out which form of understanding do you have in mind?
I've left it non-specific. The idea for that actually came in a very stray image I picked up on television a long time ago, 15 years ago. There was some other news insert about the capitals of one of the former Bantustans. I think it was Ciskei, I can't be sure. That was turning into a ghost town, basically. And just the physical image that I got from the TV, very, very briefly, I responded to. I thought that would be an amazing setting for something. Because, there it was this town built out in the bush, basically, by bureaucrats that had no reason to be there. And in fact, it was not being used. So all these buildings, all these streets were basically empty. But I didn't have the story to set there at the time. It took another, 8-9 years before the right story came to occupy that space. But yeah, that's often the case. You have the sense of the setting, but nothing to put in it. And sometimes it happens the other way around. You have to find the setting for a good idea for a story that you might have. Yeah.
See, watching TV is good for creativity.
Siphiwo, it seems to bother you a great deal that I don't have a TV.
Okay.
If I may ask, what triggers you to write a book if you don't begin with the title?
I'm sorry, what triggers you to write the book if you don't have the title?
Yes.
I find it, to be honest, a slightly peculiar question because you don't write the book to back up your title, essentially. I mean, some people might, I suppose. It's sort of like naming a child in a way. You'd have the child, and the child is a fact, but you have to name the child.
of different ways. Sometimes your book comes in the form of a snatch of dialogue. It's not always that you've got a plot laid out or the title and a plot laid out. So the title comes whenever it comes.
Yeah, but what is the thread that holds the story together?
There seems to be, for me, because I'm a very chaotic writer, I'm not somebody that sits down and structures how my book's going to go, and that's what keeps me writing, is the surprise of it, and the characters do surprise me, and the plot surprises me. But there seems to be almost an internal pilot that keeps you going, even when you're not aware of it. So I like to sort of take all the elements and becomes a big pot, and I mush it all up, and then eventually it rises, and there's the cake.
The question was about what triggers it, and I'm just, it's a bit mysterious what triggers a book. You generally, speaking for myself, are preoccupied, you're bothered with something which perhaps is not even defined for you. And that sense of trying to work something out takes concrete form in maybe an image, maybe that image on the, the TV screen that I saw, or you hear an anecdote, or you hear a story. Something suddenly seems to embody this internal conflict that you're sitting with, and you see a way to work it out on paper as opposed to just inside your mind, I guess.
There's a lady over there. Over there.
Many hands all over.
Evening, everyone. My question goes for both writers. I would like to know, how do you feel about editing? Because sometimes when you read something that you've written and you find that it has been edited, you find that some of the drive that you had when you were writing has been taken off. So how do you deal with the editing and having something that you really felt should be there taken off?
Okay. Can you just put your hand up, whoever was speaking, because we've got blinding lights. Okay. The one thing that I, as an editor, am always very particular about is to keep in the voice of the author that I'm editing. That's something that I know as an author how it feels to have an editor come along and say, no, but this isn't correct, the conversation should go like this. So I think there is a respect. A good editor will respect what you are doing and try and make it correct without taking out your voice or your style or what is important to you.
Also, editing is meant to be a negotiation, not something that's imposed on you. So it's a conversation you have, and you really shouldn't agree to changing anything that you don't see the point of changing. But a good editor can make a big difference, because you're probably the least objective person about the book by the time you finished writing it. So having an external eye to help you can be a great assistance.
And even an editor absolutely has to have an editor. You just can't get away from it because you're too close to what you've written. You need that outside eye.
Yeah. But also, Elana, in the book, this character is always asked about her job, and she says, I'm an editor. And the assumption is always that she's a newspaper editor.
Absolutely.
Does that happen to you quite often?
Yeah, there's very little understanding of what a manuscript editor is. Most people only understand newspapers, and also that confusion between a publisher and a printer. I'm in publishing. Oh, okay. We need someone to print some leaflets for us. There isn't a good understanding of what the business of publishing and editing involves.
Yeah, and the interesting extract here, it says, sometimes the writing had flair but was hamstrung by the limitations of technique, bad grounding in the complexities of the borrowed language of expression. Sometimes, against all the odds, the literary desert produced something magical at Thokozani shows. The experience thing. Okay, there's a question somewhere.
Yeah. Siphiwo, I've got the mic. Elana, you got stuck a little along the way with finishing survival training, and then you went off and wrote Shiva's Dance and published it rather quickly. Now, that's something unusual, I think, that authors can do. But was it influenced by your writing of youth literature before? And would you have been able to do an adult novel instead of Shiva's Dance? Accepting that Shiva's Dance is a youth novel. I have to check that with you.
Well, you know, Shiva's Dance, I really wanted to explore particular things. I wanted to explore the idea of we all are given a certain deck of cards in life, and all of us have something that we are struggling with. And in this case, it's dysfunctional families that the character is struggling with. So perhaps it would have taken an adult form. I don't know. I don't make those kind of decisions. The story really has its own voice. And what I was exploring is how you change that feeling of being a victim in your life into something more empowered, that you actually develop a sense of curiosity about your life, especially for young teenagers. And I feel that in some ways the character of Kate is almost a progression of what Jerry, the character in Shiva, might have turned into, this kind of quite hard-bitten woman, if she hadn't encountered the wise figure, the guy who was on her side, because we all need someone on our side. So that's what saved Jerry. Kate didn't have that. So she only got to deal with her own baggage much later in life. I don't know if that answers your question, but there's a question down here.
Please wait for the mic.
Has editing and writing always been your dream in the sense of being a career?
No. I've always written, but I've never been able to write full time, and it was through the writing that I got into editing. And then, yes, the two are very closely linked. They also work against each other quite a lot, because you're working with other people's words all day, so you get quite burnt out with words, and it gets more difficult to do your own writing after that.
Okay, maybe while we're taking the mic to the next person. Damon, you also write a drama.
I started out writing drama. It's been a very long time since I wrote for the theatre.
How did you make the transition?
I initially thought I wanted to be a playwright, and I went to UCT to study drama under the impression that it would help me in the writing of plays, and in fact it killed any desire to ever write another play again. So I switched to novels, basically. I don't think I was a very good playwright ever.
And tell me, how do you deal with tragedy? In particular, I have in mind the case of Anna. I got so attached to her, I wanted to save her,
so
but in the end...
Well, how do you deal with tragedy? Tragedy is tragedy.
It ends on the page.
Well, in the case of that particular story, perhaps not, because it was, as I said, close to home. This is there are big questions behind this, because what defines a tragedy as opposed to a comedy? Very broadly, things that end badly are tragic, and things that end happily are comic. I tend to think most things in life end badly ultimately, so maybe we all live in a state of low-grade tragedy most of the time. But in the end, they're stories. You're telling something that's got to have a pleasing aesthetic shape, in the sense of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And to that extent, both tragedy and comedy, have their shape in common.
The difference between them is just where you put the full stop. If you put it in the right place, you have a comedy. If you delay, you end up with the tragedy.
Okay, thank you.
To what extent does life experience and the way you interact with others and your travels, for example, impact on the evolution of your writing?
Is this directed at anybody particularly? Sorry, I'm going to take that. I have a peculiar relationship with fiction generally because I'm very bothered by the fact that fiction is lying, essentially. You're describing people that never existed, events that never happened, and your skill as a writer ultimately is going to be judged precisely by how convincingly you tell the lie. It probably sounds flippant, but in fact it is something that has always bothered me. And I tried with this last book, it was part of the impulse behind it, to write out of my own life in a way that wasn't obviously autobiographical or traditionally autobiographical. And there probably isn't the space or time now to go into it, but I have come to the conclusion that one's lived experience, when you write it, is probably no different to what you invent. In fact, all memory is a form of fiction. We make up the story of our lives as we go along. We tell it to ourselves, and we give it a shape and a meaning as we go. And other people, if they had to tell your life story, would tell it quite differently, and the meaning might be quite different too. So all of it in the end is fiction, and all of it in a certain sense is true.
Next question. Who's got a mic? There's a hand. So maybe in the meantime, Elana, did you really meet a meat consultancy person? The meat consultant.
Yeah, I'm going to take the view that Damon just said, that all of it is complete fiction, no truth to it at all. The truth is that writing is, you are drawing on your life experience. You just are. And some of it is pure fantasy, and some of it is what they call found stories, which are not quite yours, but they're stories you've heard or come into contact with. And the rest is well disguised stories of your own. So whether I actually met the meat consultant or not is any one of those answers.
Yes,
this question is directed at both writers. I just want to know, in terms of stories that you've come up with, have you ever suffered from doubts as to whether you should write it, or whether anyone would want to read it, or do you not really worry about whether people would read it or not? Is it more about actually just putting it down on a page?
I'll answer this one. Every single story that I write, I wrestle with whether I should write it or not, because there's always something in it that is difficult to tell, or that might impact on people around me. Or I was at a school yesterday. We were talking at a community centre, and the one child said she's got a story, she really wants to write it, but she's afraid that if she writes it, people will look at it differently. And there's an element to that as well. So I find it actually needs courage to write, even if you're writing inventive stories. I know that even my family gets me mixed up with my character Kate. So it is not an autobiographical story, but you become conflated with your characters. So there is a certain amount of risk to
Damon, almost everything you write wins or gets nominated for major awards. Is there a special recipe? I want to use it.
No, I would just point out that that's not always been the case. I've been lucky enough to land on some nice shortlists lately. I tend to get shortlisted and never to win, but even that's been very nice. I'm very grateful for it. But it took a long time before things worked out pleasantly. I've had many unpleasant and hard years, I promise you, without my television.
I'm sure there are Marxists in this house, and if Andle is here, he's a egoist. I'd like to be nominated as the president of the Galgutians. We're going to take the last two questions. Oh, there are none. Oh, okay. The future of South African writing, what can you expect from you? We only have 2 minutes.
It's anybody's guess at this stage. I have a couple of ideas, and we'll see which one comes up and carries on.
Okay, I'm interested in what Cedric was talking about. How did it happen that you wrote this book before Shiva's Dance, and yet it came out last?
Because I stopped it in the middle and wrote Shiva's Dance. And because I got tired of stopping and starting, because I only had a limited amount of time at the end of the year. You know what it's like, you've done it. You try and squeeze the story in and you run out of time and you have to go back to work, and then you've got to wait for the next holidays and you've got to start from the beginning again. And I got tired of doing that. Shiva's Dance was shorter, so I could do it in a quicker time.
And how was your rhythm after you...
After I went back to this, I came back with a completely different eye. So it was good. It was good to do the break.
Okay. And Damon, when I'm sure this time around you will win the main Booker Prize.
I'm trying to finish something up at the moment, but that's as much as I'm going to say. I have a superstition about discussing work in progress. So.
Wow. So when is it coming out? You're turning 50 this year.
I'm afraid so, yeah.
That's why I kept the beard.
Yeah, you have to compensate for what you're losing on top, I guess.
Okay, that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much, Elana and Damon. I'm sure you enjoyed it. We're going to take a 15-minute break. Carol will come over to explain the procedure. Thank you very much. I'm starting over.
Starting over. I'm starting